Washington Journal continues.
Every Wednesday, I should say, in the last hour of the Washington Journal, we're going to be taking a look at recent magazines, spotlight on magazines, and we'll look at recent cover stories. Today's is the Mother Jones magazine on the use of FBI informants to prevent a lone wolf attack. Trevor Aronson, who wrote the piece, joins us. There he was on your screen from Florida this morning. And Trevor Aronson, let me begin with this part of your story. Counterterrorism is the FBI's top priority, consuming the lion's share of its budget and much of the attention of case agents and a network of some 15,000 informants. Why so many informants? How are they being used and why?
Well, today the FBI doesn't believe that coordinated spectacular attack like we saw in 9/11 is possible. Instead, what they fear is a lone wolf, someone who is in a community somewhere in the United States and becomes inspired to commit some sort of act of terrorism on their own. And the FBI believes that its primary way of finding these people, identifying them before they attack, is through the use of informants who can go into mosques, go into community centers, and talk to people and figure out who these people would be, and then when they identify them, offer them the means and the opportunity to move forward with their terrorist plot as a way for the FBI to use its only way of getting someone off the street, which is criminal prosecution.
So who are these informants? What do they look like?
They could be your neighbors. They could be a store clerk. What we found is that they run the gamut throughout the community of different types of people. And it's important to realize that in some cases they're criminals. They became involved with the FBI because they were caught doing some sort of crime, and they're working off that crime by serving as an informant for the FBI. But in other cases, they're not, in fact, criminals at all. In some cases, they may be immigrants who had a technical violation on their immigration status, and the FBI used that as a form of leverage to get them to cooperate. In other cases, they may want to bring their family over from overseas, and the FBI is also using that as a form of leverage to get them to cooperate in federal investigation.
You said a network of about 15,000 informants. How does the FBI determine where they want to put these informants across the country?
They use a program within the FBI called domain management, and officially what the FBI says domain management is for is to allocate resources according to threats. But what FBI agents I talked to explained to me is that what domain management does is that it allows the FBI to basically create demographic maps of the country and divide the country through the use of commercially available data, immigration data. So they're able to say, okay, well, we believe that the Muslim communities in the United States pose the greatest threat for international terrorism or terrorism from within the United States. And so where do Muslims live? And they use domain management to figure that out and then assign case agents and informants accordingly to go into those communities and do as I just explained, to find the people who seem the most willing to commit some sort of act of terrorism. So
explain that a little bit more. I mean, give us examples of what these informants might do.
Sure. In the case of a man in Illinois, there was a man that the FBI identified named Derek Sharif. He, for some reason, the FBI through the use of an informant, began to realize that he was interested in committing some sort of act of terrorism. The FBI sent another informant to him who offered him a place to live. Derek at the time didn't have any money. His car was broken down, and so Derek goes and lives with the informant, and over the course of a period of weeks, they talk about committing some sort of act of terrorism. Derek said he wanted to assassinate a judge and attack a shopping mall, but of course, Derek was broke. He didn't have a car. He had no means of doing any of that. So the informant then introduced Derek to an arms dealer who could provide him with the means to commit this act of terrorism. Of course, Derek didn't have any money, and so the arms dealer agreed to exchange in trade stereo speakers that Derek had to commit this act of terrorism, to provide Derek with a grenade in exchange for the stereo speakers. And they were able to prosecute Derek, and he received 35 years for that case, for that terrorism conspiracy. An obvious question that's raised in a case like that, and in many of the cases that we looked at as part of this investigation, is whether Derek Sharif could have committed that crime were it not for the FBI providing him with the means and the opportunity to do that, to commit that crime.
In fact, that's the question you pose at the beginning of your piece. The FBI has built a massive network of spies to prevent another domestic attack, but are they busting terrorist plots or leading them? Why do you ask if they're leading them?
So as part of this investigation, we looked at more than 500 defendants in terrorism prosecution since 9/11. And what we found was that half of those prosecutions involved informants. In some cases, the informant was used in a way you would suspect. He provided information or a tip that the FBI was able to act upon and start an investigation. But in the cases of 49 defendants, what we found was that the informant acted in a much larger role. He acted almost as an agent provocateur, where he provided the means and the opportunity for the target of the investigation to move forward in a terrorist plot that he otherwise would have had no means to do. In some cases, for example, the informants provided the actual targets, the plan, and even what the dummy bombs that they would use. And in these 49 cases, according to our review, these were people that the evidence did not suggest had any capacity to commit these crimes were it not for the FBI informant or the undercover agent providing the means to do so.
So then what was the outcome of those court cases?
Entrapment has been used in a number of trials and so far has been unsuccessful. Most recently it was used in a case that the media dubbed the Newburgh Four outside New York City. These were four men who were economically depressed, living outside New York City, and an informant came to them, offered them, according to the informant transcripts, at one point offered them $250,000, offered the main defendant, James Cromedy, offered to buy him a barber shop, and throughout the case seemed to be inducing these people to commit this crime. Nevertheless, the jury did not find entrapment in that case, and they were ultimately convicted and received 35 years in prison. Defense attorneys I talked to as part of this story who defend terrorism defendants explain that meeting the bar of entrapment is incredibly difficult in federal court. And so what you and I might consider entrapment just based on the facts and reading of the case is very different from what the federal courts view as entrapment. And so far in these cases, entrapment has not been an effective defense.
Well, I want to show the viewers how the 508 cases that you looked at were prosecuted. 240 of those were charged with terrorism. 268 were charged with other crimes. Can you explain this a little bit more? And what does that say about our national security laws?
Right. So the 500 cases we identified according to how the DOJ defines terrorism. And they define the terrorism cases according to two types. The first type is the type of terrorism cases you would imagine. Someone trying to hijack an airplane, someone trying to use a weapon of mass destruction. That's type one. Type two is when the FBI or the Department of Justice are able to charge someone with a crime that isn't related to terrorism, such as money laundering or an immigration violation, but that defendant in the FBI's view has some sort of link to international terrorism. And so in some cases, the Department of Justice isn't able to prove the terrorism case, and so it settles for a lesser charge, such as money laundering. And so when we looked at the 500 cases, the actual number of cases that pose significant threats to property, to people's lives, were actually very few. The couple that come to mind are Najibullah Zazi, who came very close to bombing the New York City subway system, and Faisal Shahzad, who was unable to explode his car bomb in Times Square. But those types of cases are by far the minority of terrorism cases that the federal government ultimately prosecutes. When we say we looked at 500 cases, these were not 500 cases that, in our view, were threats to your life or national security. It was actually very few of these cases were, in fact, threats to national security or threats to people's lives.
You have a map in your story here showing federal terrorism cases that have been filed in 36 states and in Washington, D.C., so viewers can get an idea of where these cases are being filed, the majority of them along the East Coast. Trevor Aronson, the use of informants by the FBI is nothing new. So what is the story here? How did the FBI respond to what you found?
Well, while the use of informants is nothing new, I think it's important to understand the explosion of informants that we've seen since 9/11. In the mid-'70s, after the counterintelligence programs that I think most of people associate with the use of informants, there were 1,500 informants. Today there are 15,000. So that's a tenfold increase, and much of that is due to a presidential mandate from George W. Bush in 2004, where he ordered the FBI to increase its confidential human sources, which is the FBI term for informants. But what the FBI says is that the use of informants is absolutely necessary to find people who are planning or willing to do some sort of violent act within the United States. The truth is that informants, while difficult to deal with, are highly effective. The average FBI agent can't go into a community and build relationships and gather information the same way that someone from that community can. And so as a result, the FBI relies on informants to gather this type of information. And what the FBI says is that this is critical to our safety. It's critical to counterterrorism efforts to use these informants to gather this type of information.
How much are these informants being paid?
In some cases, substantial amounts. An informant named Shahed Hussein, who worked a case outside New York City, the Newburgh 4 case I mentioned earlier, he was paid $100,000 for that case. Some of the best informants move from case to case, and they can do very well. In other cases, the informants are motivated by things other than money. As I mentioned earlier, sometimes immigration violations are a big reason that people cooperate. In the case of Shahed Hussein, for example, he is motivated not only by money but also by an immigration violation. So the FBI has kind of dual leverage over him, and to this day he continues to work as an FBI informant, according to our reporting.
Before we get to phone calls, did you talk to any of these informants? What did they tell you about their role?
In some cases, the informants don't want to talk. Shahed Hussein, for example, did not cooperate. Another informant named Eli Assad just chose not to. There's another informant down in Orange County named Craig Monte, and he, about 2 years ago, blew the whistle on an operation in Orange County where he alleges he was put into mosques throughout Southern California to spy on the community as well as gather information on other would-be informants. What he alleges is that these were widespread constitutional abuses, that the FBI knew they were abusing First Amendment rights, the right to religion and right to freedom of religion, and nevertheless were sending informants into mosques, into community centers without a clear predicate, without a reason to believe that these people were up to some kind of criminal activity.
Trevor Aronson, first phone call for you comes from Jim. He's a Republican in Tacoma, Washington.
Hello, thank you. Now listen, I just want to step outside the courtroom for a second and discuss the current technological landscape in a slightly different light. These detriments and what the government's doing with the technological landscape is certainly bad, but I want to argue here that the benefits outweigh the costs in this current landscape. First of all, there's just the convenience factor alone. I mean, you want an up-to-date market report, keep tabs on stocks during the day? Sign up for PayPal. You want the Guinness Book of World Records for biggest beach party? Ask Jeeves. And that's just convenience alone. I think this is also a time when there's a private solution to a lot of the privacy concerns that you bring up, Aaron. I think this is a really disruptive new bunch we have out in Silicon Valley. I mean, did you know that Facebook was developed in a dorm room by two naked chicks?
All right. Clarence, an independent in Washington. Go ahead. Clarence, you're on the air. What's your question for Trevor Aronson?
It appears to me that what your guest there is proposing is that those who wish to protect us in this country, whose job it is to protect us, should be denied the very access to those people who are trying to do us harm. And that certainly these people who are angry or frustrated in life, these are the ones who are being sought out by those who wish to be us harm. So I think it's a good thing to be able to identify these weak spots.
Trevor Aronson?
That's true, that the people caught in these sting operations are disgruntled and have their own problems. Actually, that was a theme of all of the sting operations we looked at. These people generally tended to be poor. They tended to be desperate for various reasons, and in many cases they were recent converts to Islam who had very crude understandings of the religion that the informant, all of which the informant was able to use against them in the plot. To move them along, to say, for example, that something is in the Quran that isn't, or to say, hey, we have some money available if you'll move forward in this plot. I'm not proposing, for example, that the FBI not investigate terrorism and not investigate Muslim communities when it believes it's harboring terrorists or people in that community are up to some kind of criminal activity. I think what we're questioning is whether some of these cases the people involved would have had the ability and the capacity to commit the crimes were it not for the FBI providing the means to do so. You know, someone can be angry and say they want to go blow up a building, but very few people actually have the means to go and do that. What our investigation found was that the FBI was finding people who were angry and saying, you know, angrily they wanted to go blow up a building, lacked those means, and then the FBI in turn provided the means for them to commit that crime.
You say our investigation. Who else worked on this piece?
This was a collaboration between Mother Jones Magazine and the investigative reporting program at the University of California, Berkeley.
All right, next phone call. James, Democratic caller in Georgia.
Yes, if anybody's been involved with the judicial system like the FBI, the courts, and everything right now, till we get the legal aspects and get those people on the page to try to be legal and everything like that, we're defeating the purposes. We got enough Democrats and Republicans. They're so corrupt. The courts are corrupt. The FBI is corrupt. The CIA is corrupt. All of them's corrupt. We've got to get back to the basics, make these people start abiding by the law. Till we do, we're just wasting their time.
All right. Trevor Aronson, let me ask you about the court system and what you found when these sting operations took place. How much time are some of these folks serving who were lured into action by an FBI informant?
In the sting operations, the average tends to be about 35 years. And these operations are substantial. In some cases, the FBI spends a year or more with the target and moves them along through the plot. What we also found in this investigation that was particularly troubling for the defense attorneys involved is that oftentimes recordings are missing. So, for example, in some cases, the first months of encounters between the FBI informant and the target are not recorded, so no one knows what was said, and that's a critical period for defense attorneys in trying to prove entrapment. And so oftentimes it's a real blank slate. No one knows what exactly was said during these early investigations, and these informants often are not the most credible of people.
Well, what's going on here that some recordings are missing? What'd you find out?
That's a good question. In some cases, the FBI says that they can't record because it's just not safe to. In other cases, it's just not feasible, according to the FBI. For example, when an informant is going through a community looking for targets, obviously it doesn't make a lot of sense to record every single conversation. But I think what a defense attorney's told us is that at some point it becomes clear that this person is a target and still recordings are not made. And I think that raises a significant question of why the FBI is choosing not to record these conversations. One former FBI agent, James Weddick, told me that in many cases this is just a matter of convenience for the FBI, that it makes their jobs easier to not record these conversations. In other cases, there are recording malfunctions, according to the FBI. There was one particularly interesting case outside Baltimore where a man named Antonio Martinez, a 19-year-old convert, was involved in a sting operation where he was plotting with an FBI informant to bomb a military recruiting station. And at the same time, there was another sting operation going on in Portland, Oregon. That particular sting operation, which involved a man named Mohammed Osman Mohammed, made national news for some reason. It was a particularly well-publicized case. Antonio Martinez in Baltimore hears about this case, begins to realize that maybe he's in a sting operation too, and calls in his informant and is starting to back out of the plot. The informant then arranges a meeting to bring him back into the plot, which would be a critical meeting to have a transcript of, to understand what the informant said, what was offered to bring him back into the plot. And in that particular case, the meeting was not recorded due to what the FBI termed a recording malfunction. And as a result, Antonio Martinez did move forward in the plot and has been indicted for conspiracy to use a weapon of mass destruction.
John, an independent in Massachusetts. You're up next for Trevor Aronson.
Yeah, Greta.
But John, are you there? Sorry, I don't know what happened there, John. My apologies. All right, we'll go to Kim, who's a Democrat in New York. Go ahead, Kim.
Yeah, hi. I just wanted to say that I think that this program is nothing more than a replacement for the COINTELPRO programs that were in place in the 70s, and that if you peel back the surface, you'll find that there are thousands of law-abiding Americans who are being surveilled by the FBI for no reason at all. They've committed no illegal acts, And you should dig a little deeper in your research, and you'll see that people are being, who have committed no crime, who are engaged in ordinary political activity, lawful political activity, who are engaged in lawful protests, who are committing no crimes at all.
Trevor Aronson.
That's absolutely true. You know, there are abuses that have been documented of the use of informants by the FBI outside of counterterrorism investigations. For example, about a year ago, the Inspector General's office came out with a report that showed that the FBI was targeting political activists on the left, particularly environmental activists, that it did not have reason to believe were involved in any sort of criminal activity.
The caller mentioned one term of entrapment. You give the viewers, the readers, a guide to counterterrorism jargon in the magazine piece. She brought up COINTELPRO, I believe is how you pronounce it. From 1956 to 1971, the FBI's counterintelligence program attempted to infiltrate and sometimes harass domestic political groups from the Ku Klux Klan to the National Lawyers Guild and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. How has it changed since then?
The significant difference between COINTELPRO and what we're seeing today is that this is less of a counterintelligence program. COINTELPRO primarily was involved in disruption of organizations. So, for example, at the time, the Communist Party in the United States, you know, I think the number is 80% of its membership, dues-paying members, were actually FBI informants. So it was in fact the FBI supporting the Communist Party as a way of getting into the Communist Party and disrupting it from inside. They did similarly with the Ku Klux Klan, with Martin Luther King's organization, as well as a host of organizations on both sides of the political spectrum. The difference today, however, is that what the FBI says is that they're trying to prevent the next terrorist attack, this idea of a lone wolf. They're less interested in disrupting actual organizations from functioning and more interested in disrupting what they view as significant threats to our safety. That is, someone willing to go somewhere and use a weapon of mass destruction of some sort.
What is the Domestic Investigations and Operations Guide?
That's known by the acronym DIOG. And what that is it's basically the rules that the FBI uses for its undercover operations. And it's currently going through a revision, which has been criticized by organizations on the left particularly. One of the things that the new revision allows for example, is the FBI to go through your trash to look for information on you. For example, the FBI could go through your trash and find some embarrassing information about you and use that against you to get you to cooperate as an informant. That isn't to say that that hasn't happened in the past and that does not happen currently. In fact, it likely does. But what the DIOG does is basically give a set of rules for how the FBI can behave, how it can handle informants, and the ways in which it can recruit informants. We've never seen the full version. The versions that have come out have been heavily redacted, primarily around the use of informants and the recruitment of informants.
Bill, an independent in Fort Lauderdale. Morning.
Good morning, Trevor. Yeah, I wanted to ask you if you're familiar with Naomi Klein's book, Shock Doctrine, and how you see what you're talking about today, how that relates to what she's mentioning in her book in the bigger picture.
I'm very sorry, I have not read Naomi Klein's book. I mean, if you could maybe explain to me what her theory is, I'm happy to add to that.
Bill, you still there?
Yes,
Go ahead.
I am. Well, no, she's creating very broad strokes about interrogation and actually going back to Milton Friedman's economic picture that we kind of projected around the world. And I'm actually in the early parts of the book relating to 9/11 in 1973 with the coup in Chile, and how the CIA was involved in that. And they were using informants and stuff to also gather information about things. I just was wondering if you, and Chris Hedges has also written quite a bit about.
Well, let's put it this way, Bill. What are some of the legal, ethical situations that these that the FBI informants come into? Trevor?
I'm sorry. The FBI, I mean, as far as the legal use of informants, I mean, there isn't a problem with the legal use of informants. I mean, what we're questioning is, and what what civil rights organizations have started to question is whether the tactics that the FBI is using are appropriate or ethical. So for example, the recruitment of informants within the Muslim community is very difficult for the FBI. I mean, there aren't many people who willingly choose to spy in their communities. And so the FBI is using tactics that, while legal, are certainly questionable. So for example, the idea of using immigration against someone is very new as a means of recruiting informants. The means of for example, other means they use could be considered blackmail. For example, is finding someone who is having some sort of extramarital affair. The FBI can go to someone and say, hey, we know you're having this affair. If you work with us, we won't tell your wife. Certainly that's not illegal, but I think the question is it ethical for a federal law enforcement organization to be using that as a means of recruiting informants?
And do you suspect that the recruitment of informants will continue to go up, that 15,000 number that you have in your piece, that it'll be higher?
Absolutely. I think informants are a critical part of how the FBI operates, especially with counterterrorism. And what we're finding is that, when we looked at these 500 cases, the number of sting operations that have occurred we've seen an increase since Obama took office. And so under the Obama administration, there has been this increase in informant-led sting operations. So, extrapolating from that, I think it's fair to say that the use of informants will not only continue, but increase. And in fact, the FBI has made a significant number of measures to accommodate for this increase in informants. For example, they now have a program within the FBI that assigns agents to help maintain the credibility and judge the credibility of informants. They've invested millions of dollars in a computer system that tracks informants and allows agents, say from Kansas City, to look up, say they need an informant who fits a particular ethnic profile or speaks a specific language. That they can go into a database and enter that information and find out, well, hey, there's someone in Seattle, and they can call up the agent in Seattle and try to get the informant to be used over in Kansas City. These are all investments that the FBI has made to accommodate for this increase in informants.
And you write also in your piece that across the Bureau, agents' annual performance evaluations are now based in part on their recruiting efforts.
That's right, and in fact, particularly effective agents who are particularly effective at recruiting informants are often assigned to that task full time, or they'll go into communities and recruit informants, and then when they get them either registered or what the FBI terms a hip pocket, which is an unregistered informant, they'll then dole them out to informants working drug cases or counterterrorism cases or white collar cases, whatever the case might be.
All right, we'll go to Mary next. She's a Republican in California. Morning, Mary.
Yes, good morning. How are you doing?
Doing well. What's your question or comment?
I have a question for Trevor. It just seems to me that when informants are looking in the communities for people that have a propensity for committing a crime, whether or not they have the means to carry it out, if an informant were to pass on that particular individual and not, say, pursue it or see if he could help him in any way to develop his tendencies towards terror or something like that, why would he assume that later on, a year later, 2 years later, 5 years later, the gentleman's means or woman would improve, and then he would go forward with a plan of some kind? I find it somewhat childish to assume that just because he's calling it entrapment, that people that have a propensity for this, I mean, we were caught flat-footed, at 9/11, and therefore, and those parts afterwards. I can't consciously think that someone who would be wanting to protect this country would be so cavalier about what the FBI or the CIA or anybody in law enforcement would be trying to do to seek out people who would do us harm. And I'm just a little suspect. I don't know much about Mother Jones. I do know about Berkeley, California, since I live here. And that alone just brings me suspect as to the motivation for bringing this article. And my only other question would be, is he doing harm? Is Mother Jones doing harm to our country and putting in jeopardy any of the informants that may be helping us? And to throw out things like, you've been cheating on your wife and strong-arm into them seems a little silly to me. Yeah, if they have 15,000
Okay, Mary, I think we got your point. I want to get Trevor Aronson to respond.
The caller actually articulated the FBI's viewpoint very well. You know, what the FBI says is that when someone says, hey, I would like to go commit a act of terrorism, I'd like to go blow up this building or lay grenades in a shopping mall, what the FBI agents told me is, well, what would you have us do? Would you just say, ignore this person and hope he matures and doesn't commit this crime? Because I think that's something we can empathize with, that if you're an FBI agent and you come across someone who says he wants to commit this crime, you don't want to say, okay, well, this guy doesn't have the capacity and he'll mature, so let's just ignore him. And then 6 months later, you find out that he actually did commit the crime. I mean, I think no one wants to be that FBI agent. And so I think we can sympathize with why they are aggressive. But what we're asking is that, in these cases, even though someone says they want to go commit a crime, you actually need the capacity and the means to commit that crime. And so what the FBI is doing is providing the means, almost as a kind of a preemptive prosecution, where they can provide the means for the person to commit this crime and then prosecute them, with the theory that, hey, if we left him on the street, in a couple of years, maybe someone actually would have provided him with the bombs. What we can say is that we've never found an example of that. We've never found an example where, someone was willing to, commit this kind of crime and the FBI passed on him, and then somehow someone connected to Al-Qaeda or some kind of international terrorist group provided him with the means to go do that. There's never been an example of that. And in fact, I don't think it's particularly easy for people to get access to these types of weapons. And I think it's naive to think that there are a bunch of Al-Qaeda agents running around the country willing to provide the means for people to commit these crimes. As far as whether we're doing any sort of danger, I mean, I think, one of the purposes of journalism is to look at how your government behaves and question that. And what we're using is interviews with FBI agents. We're using available court records. Every informant that we've identified in this investigation was named in a court record somewhere, either testified at trial or was named in an affidavit. And so we're not releasing any sort of confidential material or material that's considered a national security secret. So as far as whether we're doing any harm, I certainly don't think so.
And Trevor Aronson, did you receive from the FBI any requests for clarification or correction?
No, and we worked extraordinarily hard to articulate the FBI's view, and in fact received extraordinary cooperation from the FBI. I interviewed dozens of FBI agents as part of this investigation, some of whom worked with me on background, others are quoted throughout the piece, and being able to articulate the FBI's view to explain not only why it moves forward with these sting operations, but how and what the policies are behind those sting operations was incredibly important for us.
Let's go to Brian, Democratic caller, Chicago. You're up next for Trevor Aronson.
Good morning. Mr. Aronson, you said early on that the entrapment defense has not been successful in most of these cases. I wonder if you could say something about the case of the Liberty City 7, which was one of the first of these cases several years ago, where young men in the Haitian American and Haitian immigrant community living in a housing project there in Miami were set up in a sting operation by an individual posing as an Al-Qaeda representative who actually administered an Al-Qaeda oath of allegiance to them. These were young men who had a study group where they studied the Bible and the Quran, and they actually had a security patrol in the housing project. My understanding is that all but one of those 7 were exonerated.
Trevor Aronson?
In that case, in the Liberty City case, you described it pretty accurately. These were people who lived in a poor section of Miami. They followed a religion that blended elements of Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, and did do things like, they had a community patrol that was something like the Guardian Angels. But in that case, actually, there were 7 people indicted. Ultimately, they dropped the charges against one person, and then they had 3 trials before they gained convictions on 5 of the 6. One of the 6 was acquitted. The other 5 are currently in prison. In that case, that was an example of the use of a very aggressive informant with a very checkered past. That informant, for example, had lied on a polygraph test when he was working for the FBI in Chicago, which should have excluded him from work with the FBI, but for some reason did not. He was then assigned to enter into this group posing as an al-Qaeda operative. And the primary evidence against them was he had provided them with a camera to go case the Miami office of the FBI as part of a plot to bomb that office. And in addition, they had a video recording of him administering a oath to al-Qaeda to the members of this group. And that was enough to convict them. In that case, these were men that had very little capacity to commit any crime. As one former FBI agent told me, these were men who had trouble getting up in the morning, let alone committing some sort of act of terrorism. But in this case, the FBI, through this informant, provided them with the means to move forward with this plot that ultimately involved bombing the Sears Tower in Chicago and the Miami office of the FBI, none of which they ever became close to or would have ever gotten close to were it not for the FBI. But they were able to get convictions on 5 of the 7. And then the 7th one, whose charges were dropped early on, was deported to Haiti based on evidence from that case.
Trevor Aronson, are these informants ever trained for what they're going to be doing?
No, and that's one of the concerns in the use of informants. When you look at how FBI agents are trained, they're very well trained. They not only go through role playing, but they also are studying policies and manuals and the law to make sure that when they do these operations, they're not violating constitutional rights. In the use of informants, there really isn't any sort of informant school where they send them to. These are people that they just instruct them. They say, okay, here's your wire, go talk to this person, and here's what we'd like to get from them. And the FBI is supposed to monitor them very closely as a result of this, that they're supposed to have them give them very specific instructions as to what they're supposed to do in undercover operations, as well as record the meetings, record as many of the meetings as possible. But certainly there's no kind of training for this, and as a result, I think that's why we have in these cases there are a lot of questions of whether these people are being entrapped or the actions of the informant are overly aggressive.
Mother Jones encourages you to dig a little deeper inside this magazine piece. Want to see for yourself how an FBI sting works? Go to motherjones.com, where you'll find much of the behind-the-scenes information we uncovered in this investigation. You can watch surveillance video from a terror investigation. Internal FBI documents are available. Second-guess the feds, browse profiles of all the 508 terrorism defendants and decide how much of a threat they were, and see which terror cases were tried in your state, which ones involved informants, which charges were filed, and which ones stuck. Read previous Mother Jones reporting as well on terrorism and civil liberties, including features on the Lackawanna 6, the Dirty Bomber, and John Walker Lynn, and the one-size-fits-all material support charge. So motherjones.com with more information. We'll hear from Lou next. He's a Republican in Dalton, Georgia. Lou, good morning.
Good morning.
What's your question or comment for Trevor Aronson?
Oh, I'm sorry. I
That's
thought you
all
were
right.
coming back to me. The gentleman uses the term WMD, weapons of mass destruction, quite loosely. And when we invaded Iraq, the term WMD referred to, as I understood it, nuke, biological, or chemical. And he spoke of a man named Martinez attempting to use a WMD. What does he define WMD as?
Trevor Aronson.
I'm using the definition that the Department of Justice uses, which I agree is very loose. In these cases where people are charged with conspiracy to use a weapon of mass destruction, this can be something like the use of a car bomb, for example. In a number of sting operations, the FBI has provided the target with a van or a car that they've led the target to believe has explosives in it. In one case, for example, in Dallas, of a man named Hosam Smadi, he drove the van in the garage of a downtown skyscraper, walked across the street, and dialed a cell phone that he believed would activate the bomb and destroy the building. In that case, they charged him with conspiracy to use a weapon of mass destruction. So for the purposes of federal prosecution, the definition of weapon of mass destruction isn't limited to what you might think like a chemical bomb or chemical weapon or some kind of nuclear material. It can be something as simple as a car bomb.
All right. Rose, Democratic caller in Georgia. You're next.
Good morning.
Morning.
Morning. Just 3 things I'd like to comment on. First, I want to give my full support of the FBI in this project. I think it's well needed. And just to, defend the FBI, there was a caller earlier who had said that they were wrongfully accusing people and arresting people and so on and so forth, and referenced the 40s and 50s and 60s where the Ku Klux Klan and MLK and things like that. I would just like to say that the FBI has grown along with the country. When I was in college, I used to reference the country to like a woman, America. She's, going through all the stages, growing up, all of the trials and tribulations. And so the FBI represents the problems that we have today. And, back then it represented those problems. And there wasn't always justice because there were a lot of racial issues, but we've grown since then. And I do just commend the FBI on this program. Secondly, I'd like to know how these would-be terrorists are prosecuted when they are found to be a would-be terrorist, not the ones that are exonerated, but the ones that do get sentences. Are they like 20 years, 30? Do they get a life sentence?
All right. Trevor Aronson.
In the federal system, they have what are called statutory minimums for sentencing. And in many of these cases, especially things such as the conspiracy to use a weapon of mass destruction, 35 years is the statutory minimum, which means that no matter what the judge thinks of the case, if the person was found guilty, the judge has to sentence to at least 35 years. In most of these cases, what we're finding is that the judges are sentencing to the minimum, to that 35-year mark. In one case, the Newburgh 4 case, the judge in that case said from the bench that she was very skeptical of the case, believed that the definition of terrorism has been, expanded to an enormous extent, that, what the FBI did was create kind of a, make reality out of the fantasy of the target, that because the target said he wanted to, in this case, bomb synagogues, that the FBI informant made that possible. And so what we're finding is that especially with these sting operations that involve a conspiracy to use a weapon of mass destruction, 35 years tends to be the sentence for these people.
And Mother Jones looked at 508 cases that were prosecuted related to terrorism. 240 of those were charged with terrorism. The most common terrorism charge, 192 of those cases, was providing material support to terrorists, 68 plotting violence abroad, and 36 of those cases were charged with funding terrorists, 25 weapons of mass destruction. Prairie View, Texas. Antoinette, independent caller. You're next for Trevor Aronson.
Yes, good morning, Mr. Aronson. I'm a Jamaican student here in the States right now, and the comment you made about the challenges of using entrapment as a defense in court really piqued my interest because I remember the case of Mark Myrie, also known as Buju Banton, popular Jamaican singer. He was tried here in the U.S. The informant stated that, yes, he carried the drugs, he was paid by the FBI, and so forth. And everyone thought, oh, this is entrapment, but he lost the case. As a student, I can appreciate that the layman's perception of a point of law may not be what the law states. So could you please provide me with some more insight as to what exactly entrapment is and why it's so difficult to defend in a court of law? Thank you.
Well, first of all, winning a defense based on entrapment requires the jury to agree that the person has been entrapped. And so that requires sympathy. So the jury has to be sympathetic to the person to say, yeah, this person would not have committed this crime were it not for the government providing the means. What defense attorneys find in many cases is that tapes provided by the FBI of the person talking don't instill that sympathy. For example, in these terrorism cases, these targets will say racist, anti-Semitic things, hateful things about Americans or wanting to do violence within the United States. Things that when you hear, it certainly makes you not want to like the person. And so that, for one, affects the ability of the jury to find entrapment. The other is what they consider predisposition. Was the person predisposed to committing the crime were it not for the FBI providing the means for him to do so? And that's where the real question becomes. I mean, that's where the real question is these people say they want to commit this crime, and so to a certain extent they're predisposed to doing it. and but they lack the means to commit the crime. And so if predisposition is the bar you're looking at, that is to say that the person says he wants to do it, then in these cases the Department of Justice is able to meet that predisposition bar, and as a result, winning an entrapment case is very difficult. And as you mentioned, this other case, I mean, entrapment cases, the inability to win on an entrapment defense is not exclusive to terrorism. It's something that pervades the federal system. No matter what crime you're arguing, it is very difficult to win an entrapment defense. In part because to win an entrapment defense, you have to admit that you committed the crime. That yes, I moved forward with this crime, but I wouldn't have done it were it not for the FBI. And so again, you're losing sympathy with the jury because you're admitting that you were committing this kind of crime.
Trevor Aronson is a contributing writer to Mother Jones magazine. The cover story of the most recent Mother Jones magazine, Terrorists for the FBI, Inside the Secret Network that Surveils and Entraps Americans. You can find the story on our website, cspan.org, as well as motherjones.org. Part of our weekly review of magazines, Spotlight on Magazines. Trevor Aronson, thank you for being with us and talking about your piece.
Thank you.
That does it for today's Washington Journal. We'll be back tomorrow morning, of course, 7 a.m. for more of your calls, your emails, and your tweets. But now live coverage of the House.